The morning came in gold and blue, the kind of Pacific dawn that makes men forget they're standing on the edge of an empire's war. At 0755 hours, the sky above Oahu split open with fire and metal, and in the span of 2 hours and 19 minutes, the United States Pacific Fleet became a graveyard. 8 battleships, 3 destroyers, 4 other vessels, over 2,000 souls claimed by oil-slicked water and twisted steel. The official record closes there, documented in blood and salvage reports, archived in the grief of a nation caught sleeping. But the record does not tell the whole story. What follows exists in the margins of declassified files, in testimonies that were quietly shelved, in reports stamped and buried under layers of wartime secrecy and post-war silence. This is not the story of the attack itself. That catastrophe has been dissected, memorialized, and understood. This is the story of what happened beneath the surface in the weeks that followed, when the Navy sent men down into the depths to recover the dead and salvage what remained of American power in the Pacific. This is the story of what those men found waiting for them in the darkness below. The Hawaiian Islands rise from the Pacific like the peaks of drowned mountains, which is precisely what they are. Volcanic summits thrusting up from an ocean floor that plunges to depths exceeding 18,000 feet. The islands themselves are young in geological terms, born from the slow migration of the Pacific Plate over a thermal hotspot deep within the Earth's mantle. Oahu, the third largest island, sits roughly in the middle of the chain, its windward coast battered by trade winds, its leeward side sheltered and calm. It was on this protected southern shore that the Navy built Pearl Harbor, dredging and expanding the natural inlet into the largest naval facility in the Pacific. The harbor itself is a complex system of locks and channels, named by early 20th century Americans after their counterparts in Scotland: East Loch, Middle Loch, West Loch, branching off from the main channel like fingers of a hand. Southeast Loch curves away toward Hickam Field. The entire complex covers nearly 10 square miles of water, much of it shallow, averaging 45 feet in depth along the main channels, but with pockets and mooring sites dredged deeper to accommodate the drafts of capital ships. Battleship Row, where the greatest carnage occurred, ran along the eastern shore of Ford Island, the flat rectangular landmass that divides the harbor's heart. 7 battleships had been moored there that Sunday morning, massive steel fortresses riding at anchor in water that ranged from 35 to 42 feet deep. The attack had come in 2 waves, Japanese carrier aircraft hitting with precision that spoke to months of planning and rehearsal. Torpedo bombers came in low across the harbor, their Type 91 aerial torpedoes modified with wooden fins to run in the shallow water, an innovation American intelligence had not anticipated. Dive bombers followed, then high-altitude bombers with armor-piercing shells converted from battleship ammunition. The USS Arizona took a bomb through her forward deck that detonated in her powder magazines, breaking the ship's back and killing 177 men in an instant. The USS Oklahoma rolled completely over after taking multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of men inside her capsized hull. The USS West Virginia settled into the harbor mud, flooding slowly enough that damage control parties managed to counter flood and keep her upright. The USS California sank at her moorings. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, took heavy damage and was beached to prevent her from sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entrance entirely. By midday on the 7th, the water burned. Oil from ruptured fuel bunkers spread across the surface and ignited, creating sheets of flame that consumed men struggling in the water and sent black smoke towering into the afternoon sky. Rescue parties worked through the inferno, pulling survivors from the water, cutting men out of wreckage. The following days became a desperate race against time and tide, cutting through the overturned hull of the Oklahoma to reach men trapped in air pockets, pumping out compartments, recovering bodies before they decomposed in the warm Pacific water. The Navy moved with the efficiency of an organization that understood it was now at war. Within 48 hours, salvage operations were formally organized under the command of Captain Homer Wallen, a naval constructor with extensive experience in marine engineering. His orders were simple and absolute: restore the Pacific Fleet to fighting capability by any means necessary. Raise what could be raised, repair what could be repaired. Strip the rest for parts and clear the harbor for operations. The war would not wait for morning. Native Hawaiians had stories about the waters of Pu'uloa, the old name for the inlet that became Pearl Harbor. The elders spoke of the place with a careful respect that went beyond the practical concerns of navigation and fishing. In the old tongue, they told of Aumakua, guardian spirits that took the forms of sharks and could move between the world of the living and the world of spirits. They spoke of particular sharks, known by name and temperament, that inhabited these waters and were to be honored, never hunted. One story, repeated in variations across generations, told of a woman named Ka'ahupahau and her brother Kahiuka, who became shark guardians of the lagoon and protected humans from man-eaters that came in from the open ocean. The waters were sacred, the stories said. The sharks were protectors, not predators. But the stories also carried warnings that to defile the waters, to spill blood without proper respect, to disturb what rested beneath, would draw attention of a different kind. The Navy had heard these stories, of course, in the casual way that occupying powers hear the folklore of the places they occupy. They were filed mentally under local color, the superstitions of a pre-industrial people whose islands had been annexed, territorialized, and militarized. Pearl Harbor was a triumph of American engineering and strategic vision, its waters tamed and charted and dredged to serve the needs of empire. What the elders said about sharks and spirits had no bearing on the work of salvaging a shattered fleet. The first divers went down on the 8th of December, less than 24 hours after the attack. They were Navy divers and civilian contractors, men trained in deep-sea work, equipped with Mark V diving dress, copper helmets, canvas suits, weighted belts, air hoses running to surface pumps. The water they descended into was a nightmare of zero visibility, thick with oil and debris, the sediment stirred into a permanent murk by the explosions and the settling of massive ships. They worked by touch in absolute darkness, following guidelines and cable runs, their voices crackling over communication lines to tenders on the surface. They reported the expected horrors: bodies in passageways, compartments crushed by pressure, the massive scale of destruction inflicted on the ships. They worked in shifts, in conditions that pushed the limits of their training, knowing that time mattered, that every hour counted in the desperate mathematics of salvage and war. But within the first week, some of the divers began reporting something else. The reports were verbal at first, mentioned in passing during debriefings, dismissed as the product of stress and the psychological strain of working in darkness among the dead. They spoke of movements in the water that didn't correspond to current or wreckage shifting, of sounds that carried through the water, not the creaks and groans of settling metal, but something rhythmic, almost regular, like breathing, of shapes glimpsed at the edge of their helmet lights, forms that moved with purpose and then vanished into the murk. One diver, a chief petty officer named Raymond Kowalski, submitted a formal report after his third dive on the Oklahoma. He described reaching a sealed compartment where men were believed trapped, only to find the hatch already open from the outside, the dogs loosened despite the pressure differential that should have made that impossible. The compartment was empty. No bodies, no survivors, just dark water, and the sense, he wrote this exactly, that he was being watched. The report was noted and filed. There was too much work to do, too many confirmed emergencies, to chase the phantom anxieties of divers working under impossible conditions. But the reports continued, and they began to follow a pattern that would later prove impossible to ignore. By the third week of December, The salvage operation had evolved into a precisely choreographed industrial ballet performed across 10 square miles of contaminated water. Captain Wallen's command post operated out of a hastily established office in the Navy Yard, where maps of the harbor covered every available wall surface, each sunken vessel marked and color-coded according to salvage priority. The USS Nevada, beached and accessible, was already being patched for refloating. The West Virginia and California were being pumped and sealed, their hulls shored up against further settling. The capsized Oklahoma presented the most complex engineering challenge, over 30,000 tons of steel lying turtle-backed in the mud, requiring a system of winches and patches that would take months to design and execute. The Arizona was a tomb that would remain a tomb. The decision had been made quietly, without ceremony. Too much damage, too many dead still inside. The ship would stay where she lay, a monument to the mourning that pulled America into the war. But even she required attention, pumping out oil that continued to leak from ruptured bunkers, making the wreck safe for the harbor, documenting what could be documented. Every other vessel was being systematically stripped or salvaged. This was the priority work, the visible work, the effort that would restore American naval power in the Pacific. But running parallel to the main salvage operation, a smaller unit had been quietly assembled. It operated with minimal official documentation, its reports channeled through intelligence rather than engineering command. The unit consisted of 8 divers, all Navy personnel, all volunteers selected for experience and psychological stability. They were led by Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hayward, a 34-year-old career officer who had overseen deep-water salvage operations in the Atlantic before the war. Hayward was a compact, methodical man who approached diving the way a surgeon approached an operating room, with absolute precision and an unwillingness to tolerate speculation. He had been briefed on the irregular reports coming from the early dive teams and had dismissed them as nitrogen narcosis, stress-induced hallucination, and the natural human tendency to find patterns in chaos. His orders were specific: investigate the anomalous reports, document conditions that might be causing perceptual disturbances among the dive crews, and determine whether environmental factors in the harbor water were creating safety hazards that needed to be addressed. The briefing had been delivered by a commander from Naval Intelligence whose name Hayward was not given, in an office with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. The commander had been frank. The irregular reports were creating anxiety among the dive crews. Men were requesting reassignment. Rumors were spreading through the yard. At a time when the Navy needed every available diver working around the clock, they could not afford a breakdown in morale based on ghost stories and exhausted imaginations. Hayward's team began operations on the 19th, working a separate schedule from the main salvage crews. They dove in pairs, equipped with the standard Mark V dress, but also carrying underwater cameras, bulky housings containing Kodak film cameras that could capture images in low light if the exposure time was sufficient. They carried depth gauges, thermometers, and salinity testing kits. Every dive was logged in meticulous detail: depth, duration, water temperature, visibility conditions, currents, sounds, observations. Hayward wanted data, not impressions. He wanted measurements, not feelings. The first dive went to the Oklahoma. Hayward paired himself with Chief Petty Officer Martin Delacroix, a Louisiana native who had been diving since he was 16, working salvage on Mississippi River barges before joining the Navy. They descended at 13:20 hours on a gray afternoon, the harbor surface choppy with wind. The water temperature registered 74 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface, dropping to 71 at depth. Visibility was less than 3 feet, the water still heavy with suspended oil and sediment. The Oklahoma's hull rose out of the murk like the flank of a dead whale, her port side now facing the sky, barnacles and marine growth already beginning to colonize the steel. They worked along the hull methodically, following the keel line, inspecting the torpedo damage that had caused the ship to capsize. 5 hits, maybe 6, the holes torn through the anti-torpedo blisters and into the main hull spaces. Water had poured in faster than the counter-flooding could compensate, and the ship had simply rolled over, trapping everyone still aboard. Hayward photographed the damage, his camera's flash creating brief explosions of white light in the dark water. Delacroix maintained the safety line, his voice crackling over the communications wire with steady reports of position and time. At 40 minutes into the dive, working near the ship's starboard bilge keel, now on the port side due to the capsize, Hayward noticed something that made him pause. The metal surface of the keel showed scratches, long parallel gouges in the steel that looked fresh, the underlying metal bright where the paint and oxidation had been scraped away. He called Delacroix over, and both men examined the marks in the beam of their helmet lamps. The gouges ran in sets of 4 or 5, roughly parallel, each about a quarter-inch wide and running for 3 to 4 feet along the keel's length. They looked like claw marks. Hayward's first thought was propeller damage. Some vessel had scraped the Oklahoma during the chaos of the attack or in the immediate aftermath. But the marks were on the underside of the keel, an area that would have been submerged even before the capsize, and they ran perpendicular to the direction a propeller strike would have created. He photographed them, making careful note of their position. Delacroix said nothing over the communications wire, but Hayward could hear his breathing change rhythm, coming faster through the helmet's diaphragm. They continued the dive, moving toward the stern. At 55 minutes, Hayward's depth gauge showed 38 feet, and the water around them seemed to grow colder despite the thermometer reading remaining constant. It was a subjective sensation, the kind of thing Hayward would normally dismiss, but it was pronounced enough that he noted it in his mental log. Then Delacroix's voice came through, tight and controlled. "Sir, movement at 4 o'clock, about 15 feet out." Hayward turned, his helmet lamp swinging across the murk. He saw nothing but particles suspended in water, the constant snow of debris and sediment. "What did you see, Chief?" "Something large. Passed across the visibility line. Gray or dark. Couldn't make out details." "Current-driven debris?" "Negative, sir. It was moving against the current. Lateral movement, purposeful." Hayward waited, both men motionless in the water, their lamps pointed outward. The standard procedure in these situations was to assume the simplest explanation. A piece of wreckage drifting in an eddy, a large fish displaced by the harbor's transformation, even another diver from one of the work crews. But the harbor had been mostly cleared of large fish in the days after the attack, driven away by the oil and the blood and the constant noise of salvage operations. And no other divers were scheduled in this sector. They saw nothing further. After 2 minutes of watching, Hayward ordered them to continue the dive. They completed their inspection and surfaced at 14:25 hours, having spent 65 minutes below. Back on the tender, a converted tugboat designated YF-17, they stripped out of their gear and were met by Ensign Robert Carr, the team's recorder who maintained the dive logs. Hayward reported the scratches on the Oklahoma's keel and requested that they be compared with any existing damage reports from the ship's pre-attack inspections. He made no mention of Delacroix's sighting in the official log. That would go in a separate report, the kind that went through intelligence channels. But that evening, in the cramped quarters that served as Hayward's office, he reviewed the photographs from earlier dives that had been collected as part of the anomaly investigation. Other divers had documented similar scratches, on the West Virginia, on submerged wreckage from the Arizona, on the capsized target ship Utah. Always parallel gouges, always fresh-looking, always in locations that seemed deliberately chosen rather than randomly inflicted. And in 3 of the photographs, visible in the background murk when the images were examined closely, there were shapes, blurred, indistinct, but undeniably present. Shapes that suggested streamlined forms, larger than any fish native to these waters. forms that appeared to be observing the divers from just beyond the reach of the helmet lamps. Hayward listened with the careful neutrality of a man trained to deal in facts, but he did not interrupt or dismiss. He asked about the sharks, what they looked like, how they behaved, what the old stories said about them. Alapai described them as larger than normal sharks, moving with intelligence rather than the instinctual patterns of animals. The Aumakua could take physical form, but they existed in both the material world and the spiritual realm. They could not be caught or killed in the traditional sense because they were not entirely physical beings. They were watchers, judges, protectors of the kapu, the sacred laws. What happens when the kapu is broken? Hayward asked. Alapai looked out across the harbor, where the masts and superstructures of the sunken fleet still protruded from the water like tombstones. The Aumakua do what must be done to restore balance, but they work in their own time, in their own way. Your divers, they are entering a space where the living should not go. They are disturbing the dead. The Aumakua will guide them if they show respect. But if they show arrogance, if they treat the water as if it belongs to them— He trailed off, letting the implications settle. Have you seen them yourself? Hayward asked. The sharks? Not during the day, Alapai replied. But at night, yes. Swimming patterns that no regular shark would follow. Circling the wrecks, moving in formation. My cousin, who works night security at the yard, he has seen them too. Others have. But no one reports it, because who would believe it? The Navy does not listen to Hawaiians about the land and water the Navy has taken. Hayward thanked him and left, carrying with him a growing certainty that the phenomenon his team was investigating could not be explained by nitrogen narcosis or stress. That evening, he attended a meeting in the officers' club with several senior officers involved in the salvage operation. The conversation turned inevitably to the irregular reports. A captain from the engineering corps dismissed the entire matter as predictable psychological breakdown among men working in traumatic conditions. A commander from fleet operations suggested rotating dive crews more frequently to prevent fatigue-induced hallucinations. Hayward remained quiet until directly asked for his assessment. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully. He reported the physical evidence, the scratch marks, the opened hatches, the photographic anomalies. He mentioned the native Hawaiian perspectives without editorializing. He concluded that the phenomenon, whatever its cause, was real enough to be affecting operations and deserved a more thorough investigation than had been conducted thus far. The response was mixed. Some officers appreciated the methodical approach. Others clearly thought Hayward was giving too much credence to superstition. But one man, a captain named William Saunders from Naval Intelligence, stayed behind after the meeting ended. He pulled Hayward aside and spoke in the low tones of someone sharing information that existed outside normal channels. Saunders explained that this was not the first time the Navy had encountered phenomena that did not fit conventional explanations. There were files, he said, carefully maintained and highly classified, documenting incidents across decades of naval operations. Sightings, encounters, events that suggested the ocean concealed things that modern science had not yet cataloged. The Navy's position was pragmatic: investigate enough to ensure operational safety, but do not publicize findings that would undermine public confidence or create panic. The war effort required absolute focus. Resources could not be diverted to chase mysteries that might never be solved. Your job, Saunders told Hayward, is to determine if this is a threat to the salvage operation. If it is, we deal with it. If it's not, we document it and move on. But either way, the divers need to keep working. We need those ships raised. We need this harbor operational. Understood? Hayward confirmed that he understood. He returned to his quarters and spent the rest of the night reviewing his notes, cross-referencing the dive reports with tidal charts and work schedules. A pattern was emerging, one that would have been invisible without the accumulated data. The sightings increased during night dives. They occurred most frequently near the Arizona and the Oklahoma, the two ships with the highest death tolls. And they seemed to correlate with specific phases of the work, moments when bodies were being recovered, when compartments were being opened for the first time, when the dead were being disturbed. On the morning of December 23rd, Hayward briefed his team on the next phase of their investigation. They would conduct a series of night dives, deliberately scheduled during the hours when the anomalous activity seemed most pronounced. They would work near the Arizona, where the phenomenon appeared most concentrated. They would document everything, assume nothing, and follow protocols designed for deep water salvage in hostile conditions. His divers listened with the calm professionalism of men who had chosen this work precisely because it took them into spaces where others would not go. But Hayward saw it in their eyes, the thing they would not voice aloud. They knew they were about to confirm something that would change how they understood the waters they worked in. They were about to meet the guardians that Keone Alapai had described, and those guardians were waiting. Christmas Eve arrived in darkness and unusual warmth, the temperature holding at 76 degrees even after midnight. The harbor lay still under a moonless sky, the only illumination coming from work lights on the salvage vessels and the distant glow of Honolulu to the southeast. Most of the salvage crews had been given the night off, a small concession to the holiday, but Hayward's team worked on a different schedule, one that prioritized the hours when the harbor was quietest and the anomalous reports were most frequent. They operated from a barge anchored 50 yards from the Arizona's shattered hull, the wreck a black mass rising from black water. Her forward superstructure collapsed into the crater where her magazines had detonated. Oil still leaked from her ruptured bunkers, creating rainbow sheens on the surface that caught the work lights. The smell of it hung in the air, thick, chemical, mixed with the salt and the persistent odor of decay that no amount of pumping and flushing could entirely eliminate from the harbor. Hayward dove with Chief Petty Officer Delacroix again, the two men having developed the rhythm that comes from multiple dives together. Their objective was to inspect the Arizona's starboard side amidships, where damage reports indicated possible structural weaknesses that might affect the surrounding vessels if the wreck shifted further. But the real purpose, the one documented in Hayward's sealed reports to naval intelligence, was to establish direct observation of whatever was creating the disturbances in this sector. They entered the water at 01:52 hours, descending slowly, their helmet lamps creating cones of murky yellow light in the oil-tinged darkness. The water temperature at the surface was 75 degrees, dropping to 73 at 20 feet, then stabilizing at 72 as they reached the 30-foot mark where the Arizona's deck rails became visible. Visibility was marginally better than during daylight operations. The suspended sediment had settled somewhat, and they could see perhaps 5 feet instead of 3. The Arizona's hull stretched away into darkness on both sides, a vast plain of steel that had once been the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. Now it was a crypt containing over 1,000 men whose bodies would never be recovered, who would remain entombed in their battle stations until the ship itself corroded into nothing. Hayward felt the weight of it, the sheer magnitude of the loss concentrated in this single structure. He forced the feeling aside and focused on the work. They moved along the starboard side, photographing the hull damage, testing structural integrity with hand pressure and hammer taps that rang dully through the water. At 02:11 hours, working near the aft turret complex, Delacroix signaled for a halt. His voice came through the communication wire, controlled but tense. "Sir, I'm reading a temperature drop. 5 degrees in the last 30 seconds. Hayward checked his own thermometer. 67 degrees. They had dropped 5 feet in depth, which might account for a degree or two, but not 5. He was about to attribute it to a thermocline or cold current when the temperature dropped again. 64 degrees, then 62. The change was localized. They could feel it through their suits, a pocket of cold water that had no logical source. Ascending 2 meters, Hayward ordered. They rose slowly, following the hull's curve. The temperature remained cold, 61 degrees. The water around them began to feel different in ways that were difficult to quantify. Thicker somehow, more resistant to movement, as if they were passing through a boundary between one medium and another. Then Delacroix's voice tight. Movement. Port side. Multiple contacts. Hayward turned, his lamp swinging left. At first, he saw nothing but the usual murk and suspended particles. Then the shapes resolved out of the darkness and his breath caught in his helmet. Sharks. At least 6 of them, possibly more, at the edge of visibility. But these were not the reef sharks or occasional tigers that might normally inhabit these waters. These were massive, 15 feet long at minimum, some appearing even larger. They moved in formation, circling at a distance of approximately 20 feet, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke to coordination rather than random schooling behavior. Their bodies were a deep gray that appeared almost black in the limited light, their forms sleek and powerful, built for speed and strength. But it was their behavior that froze both men in place. The sharks were not hunting, not displaying the erratic movements of predators investigating potential prey. They were observing. They circled at a constant distance, maintaining their formation, their movements deliberate and controlled. And they were focused entirely on the 2 divers, tracking them with what could only be described as intelligence. Hayward's training took over. He activated the camera, taking photographs even as his mind raced through the calculations of threat assessment. 6 large sharks in close proximity should trigger immediate ascent protocols. But these sharks were not attacking, were not even approaching. They were watching. He began documenting systematically, noting count, approximate size, behavioral patterns. Delacroix remained motionless, his breathing audible over the communication wire, coming faster, but still controlled. Orders, sir. Hold position. Continue observation. Hayward kept his voice steady, projecting calm he did not entirely feel. The sharks completed another circuit, their path taking them behind the Arizona's hull, disappearing from view for perhaps 10 seconds before emerging again on the far side. The pattern repeated, circling, watching, never approaching closer than 20 feet, never moving away beyond the edge of visibility. Hayward noticed details that would later fill pages of his report. The shark's eyes seemed unusually large, unusually expressive. Their gill slits moved in perfect synchronization despite being separate animals, and when they turned, they did so with a precision that suggested communication, as if responding to signals the divers could not perceive. After 5 minutes of observation, one of the sharks, the largest, perhaps 17 feet in length, broke formation. It moved toward the divers, closing the distance to 15 feet, then 10. Hayward felt his hand move instinctively toward the diving knife strapped to his leg, a gesture that was purely psychological given the inadequacy of a 6-inch blade against a creature of this size. But the shark stopped at 8 feet, directly in front of them, and simply held position. It was close enough now that Hayward could see details in the lamplight. The creature was scarred along its flanks, old marks that might have been from battles with other sharks or from encounters with boats and propellers. But there were other marks too, symbols that looked almost carved into the skin, geometric patterns that seemed too regular to be natural. The shark's eye fixed on Hayward, and in that moment he understood with absolute certainty that he was not looking at an animal operating on instinct. He was being evaluated by something that possessed awareness, intention, and purpose. The moment stretched. timeless in the suspended darkness. Then the shark turned, a slow, deliberate movement, and swam back to rejoin its companions. The formation reestablished itself, and the circling continued. The temperature began to rise. 64 degrees, 67-70. The pocket of cold water dispersed as if it had never existed. Hayward made the call to surface. They ascended slowly, maintaining proper decompression discipline despite every instinct screaming to get out of the water immediately. The sharks accompanied them upward, maintaining their distance, their circular pattern rising with the divers like an escort. At 15 feet depth, the formation broke. The sharks descended back toward the Arizona's wreck and vanished into the darkness below. Hayward and Delacroix surfaced at 0234 hours. The barge crew helped them aboard, and both men stripped out of their gear in silence. Only when they were out of their helmets, breathing the warm night air, did Delacroix speak. "Sir, what the hell were those?" Hayward looked back at the dark water, at the oil sheens catching the work lights, at the hulk of the Arizona lying beneath the surface with its cargo of dead. He thought about Keone Alapai's words. He thought about the intelligence reports that Captain Saunders had alluded to. He thought about the photographs in his camera, assuming they had captured anything in the darkness and murk. "Log it as unidentified large marine animals exhibiting anomalous behavior," he said finally. "We'll have a full debriefing at 0600 hours. But he knew, as certainly as he had ever known anything in his career, that they had just encountered something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional understanding. The Guardians were real. The Aumakua were present in these waters. And they had just delivered a message that neither man fully understood, but both felt in their bones. The dead of Pearl Harbor were not unprotected, and those who disturbed them did so under the watch of something ancient and powerful that answered to laws older than the Navy, older than America, older than the steel ships that now littered the harbor floor. The photographs developed poorly. The underwater camera had captured shapes in the darkness, but they appeared as blurred forms, indistinct enough that skeptics could dismiss them as artifacts of poor visibility and inadequate lighting. Hayward had expected this. Whatever these creatures were, they seemed to exist partially outside the normal parameters of documentation, as if they could choose what to reveal and what to conceal. His written report, filed through Captain Saunders' intelligence channels, described the encounter in precise technical language, but he knew that without compelling visual evidence, it would be categorized as an unusual wildlife encounter, and nothing more. The salvage operation continued. The Oklahoma's righting operation was being prepared, a massive undertaking that would require months of preliminary work. In the meantime, dive teams were recovering bodies from accessible compartments and mapping the interior damage. It was brutal work, made worse by the knowledge that many of the dead would never be reached, would remain sealed inside the ship even after it was raised and eventually scrapped. The divers rotated in and out, working in short shifts, their psychological resilience tested by the constant confrontation with mass death. On the night of December 28th, a dive crew working the Oklahoma's interior reported that they had located a sealed compartment where survivors might have lasted for hours or even days after the capsizing. The compartment was deep in the ship's interior, accessible only through a narrow passage that required removing debris and cutting through jammed hatches. A decision was made to attempt entry immediately, despite the late hour. If there were bodies that could be identified and recovered, the families deserved that closure. The dive team consisted of 4 men, led by Chief Boatswain's mate James Corrigan, a veteran diver with over 15 years of experience. They entered the water at 0257 hours, descending along the Oklahoma's exposed keel to locate the access point that had been identified during earlier surveys. The water was calm, temperature 73 degrees, visibility approximately 4 feet. Standard conditions for night operations in the harbor. Hayward was not scheduled to dive that night, but he was present on the salvage barge, monitoring communications and coordinating with the surface support crew. He listened to the routine calls as Corrigan's team descended, reached the access point, and began working through the obstacles blocking their path. The sound of cutting torches carried through the water transmitted up the communication wires as metallic screeching that set teeth on edge. At 03:18 hours, Corrigan's voice came through. "We're through the hatch, proceeding into the compartment. Stand by." 2 minutes of silence followed, broken only by the sound of breathing through the communication sets. Then Corrigan again. "Contact. We have multiple casualties. Commencing documentation. Standard procedure. Expected findings." The surface crew acknowledged and continued monitoring. Hayward stood at the barge rail, looking down at the dark water where the air hoses and communication wires descended into darkness. The night was unusually still, the harbor surface like black glass, the only sound the distant hum of generators from other salvage vessels. At 03:23 hours, everything changed. The first indication was a surge in the water around the barge, a sudden powerful current that had no apparent source. The vessel rocked and the crew grabbed for handholds. Then Corrigan's voice, tight with controlled alarm. "Surface, we have a situation. Multiple large contacts approaching our position, requesting immediate guidance." Hayward grabbed the communication handset. "Corrigan, describe the contacts." "Sir, large marine animals, estimate 15 to 20 feet in length. Count is, I'm seeing at least 8, possibly 12. They're circling the entry point. They're blocking our exit route." The sharks. They had returned, in greater numbers, and they were not simply observing. Hayward's mind raced through the tactical options. Standard protocol for shark encounters was to ascend slowly while facing the animals, to avoid creating the impression of fleeing prey. But these were not standard sharks, and this was not a standard encounter. "Corrigan, hold your position inside the compartment. Do not attempt to exit. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged." "Sir, Christ, they're not attacking. They're just holding position. It's like they're penning us in." Another voice broke in, one of the other divers. "Chief, the temperature just dropped. I'm reading 64 degrees. Hayward felt ice in his chest, the same temperature drop that had preceded the Arizona encounter. Whatever was happening, it was following the same pattern, but more intense, more deliberately confrontational. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol, but felt absolutely necessary. "Corrigan, I'm coming down. Hold your position and remain calm. They have not displayed aggressive behavior in previous encounters. They appear to be territorial, not predatory." He suited up in less than 3 minutes, Delacroix helping him with the helmet and checking the air supply. The chief's face showed what he was thinking, but did not say aloud. This was a commander's call, possibly a fatal one, but the right one given the circumstances. Hayward entered the water at 03:29 hours. The descent took him through water that grew progressively colder, the temperature dropping in layers until he was working in 60-degree water that should not exist at this depth in a Hawaiian harbor. His lamp pierced perhaps 6 feet into the murk, and at the edge of that illumination, he saw them. The formation was larger than before. He counted 14 distinct animals, some even larger than the ones he had seen near the Arizona. They had arranged themselves in a perimeter around the Oklahoma's exposed hull, specifically around the entry point where Corrigan's team had penetrated the wreck. They were not agitated, not displaying the rapid movements of predators preparing to attack. They were stationed, like sentries on watch, ensuring that the compartment remained sealed. Hayward descended to the entry point, moving slowly, projecting calm deliberation. The sharks tracked him with their eyes, but did not adjust their formation. He reached the hatch and called into the compartment. "Corrigan, sound off." "All 4 divers accounted for, sir. We have the compartment documented, ready to exit on your order." "Stand by." Hayward positioned himself facing the largest of the sharks, a massive animal that had to be 18 feet or longer, its body scarred with the same geometric patterns he had observed before. He did something that had no basis in training or protocol, but felt intuitively correct. He extended his hands, palms forward, in what every human culture would recognize as a gesture of respect and non-aggression. The shark moved forward, closing the distance to 10 feet, then 5. Its eye fixed on Hayward with that same unnerving intelligence, that sense of being evaluated and judged. Time dilated in the cold, dark water. Hayward could hear his own breathing, the hiss and bubble of the surface-supplied air, the hammering of his heart in his chest. He thought of Keone Alapai's words about respect. He thought about the 1,000 men still entombed in these wrecks. He thought about the arrogance of empires that believed they could dominate any space they chose to occupy. He spoke, knowing the shark could not hear human speech through water and helmet, but needing to voice the acknowledgement anyway. "We mean no disrespect. We're recovering the dead. We're honoring them." The shark held position for another long moment. Then, with a movement that seemed almost ceremonial, it turned and swam back to its position in the formation. The temperature began to rise. 62 degrees. 65. 68. The perimeter formation loosened, the sharks spacing themselves wider apart, creating a gap in their circle directly in line with the surface. Hayward understood. They were granting passage, but only on their terms, only after the proper respect had been shown. He called to Corrigan, "Exit the compartment. Ascend slowly and directly to the surface. Do not deviate from a vertical path." The 4 divers emerged from the hatch and began their ascent, Hayward following. The sharks maintained their positions, watching but not interfering. The exit was completed without incident, all 5 men surfacing at 0347 hours. As they were helped aboard the barge, Hayward looked back at the water one final time. In the work light's reflection, he saw the dark shapes circling once more, before descending into the depths, their duty apparently fulfilled for the night. The debriefing that followed was tense and inconclusive. Corrigan and his team confirmed everything Hayward had observed: the large sharks, the organized formation, the temperature anomalies, the sense of deliberate intelligence behind the encounter. But even among the men who had experienced it directly, there was a reluctance to articulate what it meant. To say it aloud would be to admit that the Navy was operating in waters controlled by forces that did not answer to admirals or war departments, forces that predated human presence in these islands by centuries or millennia. Captain Saunders arrived at the barge at 0500 hours, his face unreadable. He listened to the reports, examined the logs, and then pulled Hayward aside for a private conversation on the barge's stern deck as dawn began to break over the harbor. "You're going to write this up as a near miss with aggressive marine wildlife," Saunders said. It was not a question. "You're going to recommend modified dive procedures for night operations, increased surface support, better lighting. You're not going to mention guardian spirits or intelligent behavior or any implication that these animals are anything other than animals." "Is that an order, sir?" "It's reality. The salvage operation cannot stop. The war cannot stop. We have confirmed that there is something unusual in these waters, and we have confirmed that it responds to certain behaviors. Your job is to figure out how to work around it, not to explain it. Can you do that?" Hayward looked out across the harbor, where the first light was touching the tops of the wrecked ships, turning them gold and red like monuments in a cemetery. He thought about the weight of command, about the gap between what is true and what can be officially acknowledged. He thought about the men still diving these waters, still recovering the dead, still working to restore American naval power, while being watched by creatures that had their own authority, their own claim to this place. Yes, sir. I can do that. The official report, filed by Lieutenant Commander Hayward on January 3rd, ran to 47 pages of technical documentation, photographic evidence, and procedural recommendations. It described a series of encounters with large tiger sharks, possibly a resident pod that had been displaced by the attack and subsequent salvage operations, but remained in the harbor due to abundant food sources. It noted that the sharks displayed unusually coordinated behavior, which was attributed to social bonding patterns observed in other apex predators. It recommended modified diving protocols for night operations, including increased surface illumination, acoustic deterrent devices, and mandatory buddy systems for all penetration work inside wrecked vessels. The report made no mention of guardian spirits, supernatural intelligence, or temperature anomalies that violated known thermodynamic principles. It was filed, reviewed, and approved by the appropriate command structure. Copies were distributed to salvage operation commanders and dive team supervisors. The recommendations were implemented immediately, and over the following months, they proved effective in reducing diver anxiety and improving operational safety. The sharks continued to appear during night operations, but incidents of close contact decreased significantly. The pattern suggested that once the divers demonstrated consistent respect for the wrecks, entering slowly, working carefully, recovering bodies with appropriate solemnity, the encounters became less confrontational. But alongside the official report, another document made its way through channels that existed outside the normal military hierarchy. This report, classified at a level that would not be acknowledged publicly for decades, went to a small office in Washington, D.C. that coordinated what the intelligence community called anomalous maritime phenomena. The office had no official name and appeared on no organizational charts. Its staff consisted of 3 naval officers, 2 civilian analysts, and a research librarian with access to archives dating back to the earliest days of American naval operations. They collected, analyzed, and cataloged incidents that fell outside conventional explanation, but could not be simply dismissed as fabrication or error. Hayward's classified report was more candid. It documented the observed intelligence of the creatures, their apparent ability to manipulate water temperature, their response to gestural communication, and their seeming role as guardians of the dead. It included testimony from Keone Alapai and references to Hawaiian cultural traditions regarding Aumakua. It concluded with an assessment that would have been professional suicide if made public. The phenomenon represented a genuine unknown that warranted serious scientific investigation, but such investigation would necessarily conflict with operational priorities during wartime. The recommended approach was to acknowledge the phenomenon's reality while working within its apparent boundaries rather than against them. The response came 3 weeks later in the form of a visit from a civilian consultant, a man named Dr. Marcus Kellerman, who presented credentials from the Office of Naval Research, but whose actual institutional affiliation remained vague. He spent 2 days interviewing Hayward, Delacroix, and the other divers who had experienced direct contact with the sharks. He reviewed the photographic evidence with particular attention to the markings on the creatures' bodies. He met with Keone Alapai and several Hawaiian elders who were willing to discuss the traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Kellerman's conclusion, delivered in a briefing attended only by Captain Saunders and Hayward, was carefully worded but essentially confirmed what both men had already accepted. The sharks were not conventional animals. They exhibited behaviors consistent with what anthropologists would classify as totemic guardians, physical manifestations of cultural beliefs that had somehow acquired genuine agency and power. Whether they were spiritual entities taking physical form or animals that had been elevated to a liminal state through centuries of ritualized attention and respect, the practical result was the same. They possessed intelligence, they responded to human behavior, and they appeared to have a specific mandate regarding the waters of Pearl Harbor. The question, Kellerman said, is whether this is unique to this location or part of a broader phenomenon. The Navy has similar reports from other Pacific locations, from the Caribbean, from the Mediterranean. Wherever humans have established long-term sacred relationships with maritime spaces, we find accounts of protective entities. Most are dismissed as folklore. Some, like this, cannot be so easily categorized. "What's your recommendation?" Saunders asked. "Operationally, continue what you're doing. The modified protocols are working because they align with the behavioral expectations these entities appear to have. Treat the wrecks with respect. Don't rush the dead. Acknowledge that you're working in a space that isn't entirely yours. Strategically," Kellerman paused, choosing his words carefully. "Document everything, but don't publicize. The American public is not ready to confront the possibility that their scientific worldview is incomplete. And frankly, neither is the Navy. But keep records, build institutional knowledge. Because this war is going to take us into waters all across the Pacific, and we're going to encounter this phenomenon again." The salvage operation continued through 1942 and into 1943. The Oklahoma was gradually righted in one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the war, a process that took 8 months and involved 21 massive winches pulling in synchronized precision. Bodies were recovered when possible, documented, and sent home to families who had waited months for confirmation of what they already knew in their hearts. The West Virginia and California were refloated, repaired, and eventually returned to service. The Nevada was patched and sailed under her own power to the West Coast for full restoration. The harbor was cleared, deepened, and expanded to handle the massive logistics operation that would fuel the American advance across the Pacific. Hayward remained at Pearl Harbor until May of 1942, when he was reassigned to salvage operations in the South Pacific. His team was dispersed, its members sent to various posts where their expertise was needed. Chief Delacroix went to the Philippines. Ensign Carr transferred to submarine duty. The men who had encountered the Guardians in the dark waters of Pearl Harbor carried that knowledge with them, but rarely spoke of it, even among themselves. It existed in the category of experiences that resist articulation, that can only be understood by those who were present. The encounters with the sharks continued throughout the salvage operation, but they evolved. As the months passed and the dive crews demonstrated consistent respect for the dead and the waters, the confrontations became less frequent and less intense. The sharks maintained their presence. Night divers would still occasionally report seeing them circling in the distance, still sense the temperature drops that announced their proximity. But the relationship had shifted from confrontation to something closer to coexistence. It was as if an understanding had been reached, an accommodation between two forces with legitimate claims to the same space. Keone Alapai continued working at the Navy Yard throughout the war. He never spoke publicly about his conversations with Hayward or his role in helping the Navy understand what they were encountering. But other Hawaiians noticed changes in how the salvage crews conducted themselves, small adjustments in procedure and attitude that suggested someone had explained the old ways, the proper protocols for working in sacred waters. The Navy had come to Hawaii as occupiers and exploiters, taking what they needed without consultation or respect. The attack had forced them to confront the consequences of their presence. And in the dark waters of Pearl Harbor, among the dead and the guardians who watched over them, a different kind of understanding had been negotiated, not through treaties or formal agreements, but through direct encounter with powers that predated and transcended modern authority. By the time the Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, 19 years after the salvage operation concluded, Pearl Harbor had been transformed. The base had expanded massively during and after the war, becoming the keystone of American power projection in the Pacific. The wrecks were long gone, razed and scrapped or left in place as monuments. The oil that had burned on December 7th had dissipated, the debris had been cleared, and the water had been cleaned and maintained to support ongoing naval operations. But the sharks remained. Divers working on routine maintenance, researchers studying the Arizona Memorial's structural integrity, even recreational divers authorized to work in the harbor reported occasional encounters with unusually large sharks that displayed behavior inconsistent with normal tiger shark patterns. The sightings were noted in logs, mentioned in informal conversation, but rarely investigated officially. The understanding established in those first desperate months after the attack held firm. Respect the space, respect the dead, and the guardians would permit the work to continue. The men who had been there in December of 1941 and January of 1942 aged and retired and eventually died, taking with them the direct memory of what they had experienced. Hayward retired as a Rear Admiral in 1962, his career distinguished by pioneering work in deep-water salvage and underwater engineering. His classified reports remained sealed in archives accessible only to those with specific clearance and specific need. Delacroix died in 1968, having never spoken publicly about the Pearl Harbor encounters. The official narrative of the salvage operation focused on engineering achievements, on human courage and determination, on the remarkable recovery of American naval power after catastrophic loss. But in certain circles, among certain communities of knowledge, the fuller story persisted. The Navy's Anomalous Phenomena Office continued to collect reports from across the Pacific. Anthropologists studying indigenous maritime cultures found consistent patterns of guardian traditions. Marine biologists occasionally encountered shark behaviors that defied conventional explanation. The pieces existed in separate files, disconnected fragments that would take decades to recognize as parts of a larger pattern. And in Hawaii, among the descendants of those who had always known the truth about Puuloa and its protectors, the story of the Navy divers who learned respect the hard way became another chapter in the ongoing narrative of the Aumakua, proof that even the most powerful empire in the world could be taught that some authority predates nations, that some laws are older than constitutions, and that some guardians never surrender their watch. The first batch of Pearl Harbor salvage operation documents was declassified in 1993, part of a broader initiative to release World War II records after the standard 50-year classification period had elapsed. Historians and researchers descended on the newly opened files with the eagerness of prospectors discovering a fresh claim. The engineering documents proved valuable for understanding the technical achievements of the salvage crews. The operational logs provided new insights into the immediate aftermath of the attack. The casualty reports offered painful confirmation of losses that families had mourned for half a century. But certain documents remained classified. The requests for their release were denied, with standard bureaucratic language about ongoing security concerns, protection of intelligence methods, and privacy considerations for individuals still living. No further explanation was provided. The researchers noted the gaps in the record, but moved on to documents they could access. This is how suppression works in modern bureaucracies, not through dramatic confiscation or destruction, but through quiet retention, indefinite classification, and the simple fact that most people stop asking after the first denial. The files that remained sealed included Lieutenant Commander Hayward's classified report, the correspondence with Dr. Kellerman's office, and a substantial collection of testimony from Hawaiian civilians who had been interviewed about local traditions and observations. Also retained were a series of photographs that had been enhanced using techniques developed during the Cold War, images that showed with greater clarity what the original underwater photographs had captured in the darkness of Pearl Harbor's depths. These enhanced images revealed details that would have been impossible to explain in conventional terms: the geometric patterns on the sharks' bodies that resembled deliberate carving or tattooing, the eye structure that appeared more complex than standard shark anatomy, and most disturbing, what looked like coordinated response to the camera itself, as if the subjects understood they were being documented and were choosing what to reveal. A note in Hayward's file, written in 1962, shortly before his retirement, addressed the question of eventual declassification. He wrote, "These events occurred and were documented accurately to the best of our ability under difficult conditions. Future researchers will need to decide whether the public interest is served by full disclosure or whether some truths are too disruptive to the consensus understanding of reality. My recommendation is that these files remain sealed until such time as the broader phenomenon of anomalous maritime encounters has been sufficiently documented to provide context. Released in isolation, this material will be dismissed as wartime stress and superstition. Released as part of a larger pattern, it might contribute to genuine understanding." The broader pattern Hayward referenced was never officially assembled. The Navy's Anomalous Phenomena Office was quietly disbanded in 1975, its files absorbed into various intelligence agencies and research institutions. Some documents were transferred to the Office of Naval Research's Marine Biology Division, where they were filed under exotic species investigation. Others went to behavioral psychology units studying stress response in extreme environments. The institutional memory of the program's actual purpose fragmented across multiple agencies, each holding pieces of a puzzle without clear understanding of the larger picture. But the phenomenon itself continued. Through the 1950s and 60s, American naval operations across the Pacific generated sporadic reports of unusual encounters with marine life, displaying apparent intelligence and territorial behavior. Submarine crews reported being followed by large animals that maneuvered in ways inconsistent with natural predation patterns. Divers working on underwater construction projects described encounters with sharks that seemed to be observing and evaluating rather than hunting. Naval facilities in Guam, Midway, and the Philippines all accumulated their own collections of unexplained incidents that were documented, filed, and quietly forgotten. The pattern extended beyond military operations. Indigenous communities throughout the Pacific maintained their traditions regarding ocean guardians, and Western anthropologists documented these beliefs while generally treating them as cultural artifacts rather than descriptions of genuine phenomena. The disconnect between indigenous knowledge and Western scientific framework remained absolute. One side knowing through lived experience and cultural transmission, the other side dismissing what could not be replicated in controlled conditions or explained through existing theoretical models. In Hawaii specifically, the relationship between the native population and the military presence remained complex and often contentious. The islands had been annexed, overthrown, and occupied through a series of actions that violated Hawaiian sovereignty. The attack on Pearl Harbor had further militarized the islands, and the subsequent decades saw massive expansion of military infrastructure at the expense of native land and cultural sites. But beneath this political conflict, a different kind of understanding persisted among those who worked the waters: fishermen, divers, cultural practitioners who maintained traditional relationships with the ocean. They knew that the Aumakua remained present, that the guardian sharks still circled the places where blood had been spilled and the dead lay unrecovered. The Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, became the most visible symbol of Pearl Harbor and the attack that brought America into World War II. Over 1 million visitors per year came to stand above the submerged battleship and pay respects to the men still entombed below. The memorial's design, created by architect Alfred Price, deliberately evoked both sorrow and strength, a white structure spanning the sunken hull, its center sagging to represent initial defeat, its ends rising to symbolize ultimate victory. What was not publicized in the memorial's design philosophy was the extensive consultation with Hawaiian cultural advisors who ensured that the structure respected the kapu of the site, that it honored both the American dead and the indigenous protocols for sacred waters. Maintenance divers who worked on the memorial's foundations and the Arizona's ongoing structural stabilization were briefed informally on what to expect. The briefings never made it into official training materials, but they were passed along by senior divers to newcomers, a form of institutional knowledge that existed outside written records. The advice was practical: work during daylight hours when possible, move deliberately, show respect for the wreck, don't disturb areas where remains might still be present, and if you encounter large sharks exhibiting unusual behavior, maintain position, avoid sudden movements, and wait for them to withdraw. The advice was attributed to lessons learned during salvage operations, but the specific reasons were left unstated. Over decades, enough incidents accumulated that certain researchers began to recognize patterns. A marine biologist named Dr. Sarah Chin, working at the University of Hawaii in the 1980s, collected reports of anomalous shark behavior in Hawaiian waters and found concentration points that correlated with historically significant sites, battle locations, burial grounds, places of traditional ceremony. Her preliminary paper on the subject, submitted to a marine biology journal in 1988, was rejected as insufficiently rigorous and potentially culturally insensitive. The research was never published, though Chin continued to collect data and maintained correspondence with other researchers who had encountered similar patterns in different Pacific locations. The suppression was not coordinated or conspiratorial. It emerged naturally from the incompatibility between the phenomenon and the frameworks available to explain it. Military institutions could not officially acknowledge encounters that suggested spiritual or supernatural elements. Scientific institutions could not publish findings that violated established principles of animal behavior and physics. Indigenous communities had no interest in sharing sacred knowledge with authorities who had historically exploited and dismissed their traditions. The phenomenon existed in the gap between these incompatible domains of knowledge, documented but not acknowledged, experienced but not explained. Hayward died in 1994 at the age of 87, having never spoken publicly about the Pearl Harbor encounters. His personal papers, donated to a Naval Historical Foundation, included journals and correspondence that referenced the events obliquely, but provided no detail that would compromise the classified status of the official reports. In one letter written to Chief Delacroix in 1970, he noted, "I think often of our time in the dark water and of what we learned there about the limits of our understanding. The Navy taught us to be masters of the sea, but the sea had other lessons to teach. Lessons about humility, about respect, about powers that existed long before we arrived and will persist long after we're gone. I regret that we cannot share these lessons more broadly, but I understand why we cannot. Some truths are too large for the structures we've built to contain them." The classified files remained sealed through the turn of the century. Periodic reviews by archivists and declassification committees resulted in continued retention, the official justification evolving, but the outcome remaining constant. By 2020, most of the personnel directly involved were deceased, but the documents remained classified, now protected by bureaucratic inertia as much as active suppression. Researchers occasionally requested access and were occasionally denied, but the broader Pearl Harbor narrative had been so thoroughly established in public consciousness that these gaps in the record drew little attention. But the phenomenon persisted, continuing to generate new encounters that were documented in the margins of official reports, mentioned in informal conversations, and remembered by those who experienced them directly. The Guardians of Pearl Harbor remained present, fulfilling the mandate that had been assigned to them by traditions older than nations, watching over waters that had been consecrated by blood and sacrifice. The Navy continued its operations, The tourists continued their visits, and beneath the surface, in the spaces between light and darkness, the Aumakua maintained their eternal circuit, protecting, judging, ensuring that respect was paid to the dead and to the sacred nature of the place where so many had died. The full story of the phantom divers of Pearl Harbor remained what it had always been: documented but suppressed, experienced but unexplained, real but unacknowledged. It existed in sealed files and fading memories, in indigenous traditions and unofficial briefings, in the accumulated weight of testimony that could not be dismissed but could not be officially confirmed. It represented a truth too complex for the simplified narratives that nations and institutions require to function, too challenging for the materialist worldview that modern civilization has built its confidence upon. And so it remains, waiting in the archives alongside thousands of other documented encounters with phenomena that resist conventional explanation, part of a shadow history of human experience that suggests the world is larger and stranger than our maps acknowledge, that ancient powers continue to operate beneath the surface of modern reality, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only respected and remembered by those who have stood in their presence and recognized, in that moment of confrontation, how little we truly understand about the forces that shape our world.